So as we have participants from 58 countries, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the 5th session of ILSI Annual Symposium. And this session is quite special for me. It is the second year that the American Society for Nutrition is working with us and organized a session. So again, it's really a pleasure to welcome ASN on ILSI annual meeting. I want to thank very much the ASN president, Dr. Lindsay Allen, also Connie Weaver, who worked with Lindsay to put this session for you today. And I would like also to thank colleagues at ASN, Gwen Tillman and Sarah Holhorst, who also helped coordinating the session. So maybe just a disclaimer. The views expressed in the following presentation are solely those of the speakers and do not necessarily represent the views of ASN or ILSI, and each speaker had the total freedom to prepare her or his presentation. So let's now start with the session on consideration for implementing globally harmonized nutrient reference values. I'm happy to welcome our two co-chairs, Dr. Connie Weaver. She's Purdue University Distinguished Professor Emerita and the CEO of Weaver and Associate Consulting, and Emorn Udomkesmalee. She's from the Institute of Nutrition, Mahidol University in Thailand, but also Bloomberg School of Public Health, Johns Hopkins University in the USA. So welcome to both of you, and I'm giving you now the floor. Connie?
Yes, it's so nice to be working with Emorn again. She came to Purdue during some of the studies that we were working on in children, and I haven't seen her for a long time. So thank you to Emorn and all the speakers. Next slide, let me tell you a little bit about our sponsor, American Society for Nutrition. We're grateful for the second year in a row for them to host a symposia, to sponsor us symposia on harmonized nutrient reference values. ASN, it was established in 1928. It has more than 7,500 members from more than 100 countries. The major nutrition journals are kind of housed in the society, including the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, Journal of Nutrition, Current Developments in Nutrition, and Advances in Nutrition. So operating under 3 councils and 18 research interest groups, it has something to offer for everyone interested in nutrition. So the next slide. Oh, I guess I have the control. I didn't realize. Thank you. Shows that we have an amazing lineup today. These are the people that have been working on the ground floor of harmonized nutrient reference values. So you couldn't learn from any better group that has been working on this. And we will introduce them one by one when it comes time for their presentations. I want you to know that when it's time during the panel discussion to submit questions, the questions box is a little difficult to read. So you'll see the arrow pointed on this screen to the questions, and you enter your question. And if it's directed at a particular speaker, please use their initial. For me, CW, Lindsay Allen, LA, Anna Lartey, AL, Anna Kerpad, AK, and Emorn, Udomkesmalee, EU. And then we'll have the right person answer it. So I want to ask your questions to set the tone for considerations for implementing globally harmonized nutrient reference values. Can one size really fit all? I really was a skeptic some years ago. I didn't see how we could have very tall people having the same energy requirements as very short people, or that people who lived in sunny environment could have the same vitamin D requirements as someone who lived in an environment that was mostly dark or away from the equator. But when they started looking at energy, the World Health Organization, they found that for energy requirements, we were all really a continuum. And there are differences, whether they be genetic, diet, environment factors that can influence the requirements. Because we're all in a continuum, maybe we can have the same approach for nutrient intake. So it took 20 years to do this for energy, and we need to be on a faster track for all the other nutrients. And this group has made a stab at that. Last year at the ILSI annual meeting in Costa Rica, in our session on harmonized nutrient reference values, we learned about the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine model for developing the HRVs. And we had a very lively discussion with the audience about the status of where different regions were in considering harmonized nutrient reference values, what they saw as the barriers to create them and adopt them for their local regions. We were introduced to the toolkit, and you'll hear about the toolkit from Lindsay Allen, which regions need or nations need in order to be able to consider harmonized nutrient reference values. Today, we're going to learn about the progress since then, because the toolkit has been published, other work has been completed, but we're still rather at the beginning for adoption of harmonized nutrient reference values. And we will have time in the panel discussion to hear your concerns and the reflections for what is needed for adoption of these and who will use them when they are created. So let me begin with the first speaker, who's one of the leaders in this area, and that's Lindsay Allen. And Lindsay Allen is no stranger to most of us because she's the current president of the American Society for Nutrition. And harmonized nutrient reference values is one of her pivotal goals as president, and hence this symposia sponsored by American Society of Nutrition to take that forward. Lindsay Allen is a research physiologist and the former director of the United States Department of Agriculture, ARS Human Nutrition Research Center in Davis, California. She has been studying, and is well known for many years, looking at the prevalence, causes, and consequences of micronutrient deficiencies. And not only has she studied this, but she's had a leadership role for the whole world to consider and come together. She has run many randomized controlled trials testing micronutrient supplements, food fortification, and food-based approaches. And more recently, she's been working with a focus on breast milk composition, and is going to update us in great ways since the 1970s, which was when the last major work was done on human breast milk composition. She has been past president of the Society for International Nutrition Research and spends much of her leadership time with micronutrient deficiencies and concerns all around the world. So who better to talk to us about harmonized nutrient reference values than Lindsay? So let's turn the floor over to Dr. Allen.
Thank you very much. Can you hear and see my screen fine?
We cannot
see your screen yet.
But you are presenting. So you should have received a message asking you to share your screen.
And I did.
Try again.
Steve, any advice?
Yeah, try to do it again. Make yourself the presenter, Stefan, and then pass it over to her again. And then she should see the message.
Screen. There we go. Presenter. So I just did it again.
Yep.
Yeah, just click that show screen button that just popped up.
Oh dear.
We did it earlier, it worked.
Can you show for me?
The other option is at the very top of the control panel, there's a sharing drop down. If you click that and hit the play button, you should be able to show your screen that way too. You have to expand that sharing button. And there's a play stop button.
You see the play, big arrow, show screen. Lindsay?
Yes, I do, and I'm clicking on it.
And it doesn't work? Okay, if not,
No.
I can pull up your slide. I have your slide.
Yes, please do. Please do.
Sorry. Okay. Okay.
That's fine.
Yeah, that's fine. Go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Okay. So yes, I'm very, very happy to be with this group of people who are really thinking about harmonization of nutrient reference values. And what I hope to do is follow up and expand on what's been happening since last year in Costa Rica, where we were very happily at our meeting and discussing all this together. But I hope to sort of update you a little on what has been happening. So next slide are my disclosures. Well, my disclosures are that I'm funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Wellcome Trust, president of ASN, and I'm a member of scientific advisory committees in unpaid positions, and there's no conflict of interest. Next slide. So what I'm trying to do today is do a brief summary to start with on which values are needed. The terms dietary reference intakes and nutrient reference values mean the same thing in my presentation. We've kind of evolved from DRIs in some countries to NRVs. It's a more sort of international concept. So I'm going to talk about why we need two particular values that many people do not have at this point in time. Talk about the National Academy's process to harmonize the approach to setting NRVs. That can be confusing, and I hope that we can differentiate between harmonizing the approach, the way that you set NRVs, and down here later, the actual harmonized values that I have proposed along with some colleagues. So we're going to talk about the process of harmonizing the approach, the toolkit that Connie mentioned that came out this past year, harmonized values, and the big discussion I would like to have is can we use, in fact, globally harmonized values for NRVs, which is what Connie was suggesting might be possible. And then a little bit about future plans. Next slide. So this is the terminology for nutrient reference values. There are two yellow boxes, which are the most important nutrient reference values. The average requirement, which is the requirement of the average requirement of a population group, and the upper nutrient level, which is the intake level, which says increased risk of adverse effects of intakes at that level. In between, there's something called the individual nutrient level, the RDA, RNI, PRI, depending on which group is setting that. And that is for individuals not for population application, and it's usually about 2 standard deviations above the average nutrient requirement or the average requirement. Next slide. So which NRV to use for which purpose? The EAR, again, is very prominent here. For assessing adequacy of intake of individuals, you use the EAR, and of populations, you use the EAR. For planning diets for individuals, you use the RDA. But for populations, population groups, you need to arrange or have an intake level which is between the EAR and the UL, is called the target median intake. And this is, I would say, a concept which has been expanded by this paper in March of this year by Suzanne Murphy and Yakteen from the National Academy and Alicia Karakiri. And this talks about how you use the NRV values for a child care and adult care food program for planning the program. So that's how you plan for your population group. So why are we really anxious about these nutrient reference values out there? Well, they have many, many uses listed in the first bullet. Planning, food-based dietary guidelines, food programs. I really first got into this, or a lot of it, for food fortification, planning food fortification. You need the same values across countries, really, when you're doing that, and you need EARs and ULs. For many, many purposes, then we need NRVs. But there are lacking ARs and ULs in many countries and agencies. I know some in Southeast Asia, I think, are lacking those ARs in particular. And FAO, WHO has almost none of those either. So instead, people are using RDAs or RNIs, which are supposed to meet the requirements of almost everybody in a sex age group. And so if you're evaluating prevalence of inadequate intakes against the RDAs, you are vastly overestimating the prevalence of nutrient inadequacy or inadequate nutrient intakes. So to my mind, having ARs and ULs to assess intake adequacy and safety is much more important than huge efforts that some countries or regions go to every 5 or 10 years in fine-tuning the RDAs. The RDAs are not that useful. Finally, I don't think we're going to suddenly get more scientific investment in filling in these gaps. The gaps are there because they're often caused by having a difficult population group, perinatal period, young children, and so on. And the cost of redoing systematic reviews is very prohibitive. Next slide. So the National Academy has been one of the leaders in talking about the need to use the same approach to deriving NRVs, not necessarily the same values, but the same approach. And this would vastly help the transparency of the values and enable nutrient review panels to use each other's information. It would provide support for LMICs, low middle income countries, to adapt the existing DRIs to their population, compare intake adequacy across populations, and then this would be a common basis for establishing nutrient policies, such as fortification, feeding programs, regulation, and trade. And Anna today is going to talk about the latter of those. So this is the approach. And this is the book that came out in 2019, available on the web, on the approach, a generic method for developing NRVs. So the focus is on setting an AR and a UL and improving access to tools and data for setting intake recommendations. And then this was followed by a toolkit that I'll also talk about, and it's also in this book, talking about the generic resources that are needed to do this job, the huge resources needed to do this job, and how can we share them better? How can we make them available in data banks? And it lays out essentially the choice of setting how people set recommendations. You could derive a whole new set of NRVs or modify some existing NRVs that are available currently locally or globally, or just use existing NRVs that have been published after spending tens of millions of dollars by the IOM, Institute of Medicine, and the European Food Safety Authority, for example. And then finally, I'm going to suggest that we have, in fact, harmonized the EFSA and National Academy NRVs, and perhaps those would be useful. Okay, next slide. So this not very clear picture is from the toolkit from the National Academy, published last year. And it essentially lays out that two-pronged approach, which I was mentioning. Whatever you do at the beginning, you have to get expert panels, evaluate the existing values, and we'll hear from Anura what they did in India along these lines. I'm very interested to hear his presentation on this. And so on the left-hand side, it's not establishing completely new ones, keep the old ones, update, adapt them, but you still have to describe all the outcomes you selected, the approach you use, get the evidence base, evaluate usual intakes and dietary patterns of your population. And that's simply to really getting dietary information is useful for bioavailability estimates, for setting the values for the absorbed nutrients, and then finally decide whether to adjust your own values and how to do that. The right-hand side is if you want to start from scratch, establishing new NRVs, and the methods you use, it could be dose response assessment, factorial approach, and you go through again looking at dietary patterns to get bioavailability, assess the local context, and decide whether to accept, revise, or derive NRVs. So this toolkit has a start on supplying information which should be useful for everybody. You know, where can you get the resource and dietary intake if you haven't done it in your particular country? What are some of the bioavailability adjustments and so on? It's not finished yet, and the National Academy wishes to proceed with this in the next few years. Next slide. This is a slide that actually Ken Brown put together for another meeting we had recently, and just shows the steps that FAO, WHO, EFSA, and the national academies go through to develop their dietary reference values, or their NRVs, I should have called those. He called them DRVs. And so, for example, here's the FAO process, and they're starting right now to revise the recommendations for young children. So they have to have an expert group, a scoping review. National Academy does that too. Is there enough new literature to make a difference? Should we do this? You've got to have the problem formation, particular format called PICO to do that, and a public consultation. The National Academy, moving over to the right, does a systematic review. Systematic reviews are hugely expensive, and there should be a repository for these. So systematic reviews, expert reviews, consultations, on and on. And at the bottom here, it takes 12 to 36 months for FAO, WHO to come up with a value for a nutrient, or maybe a couple of nutrients, and it costs $10,000 to $100,000 per review, and a lot of staff and volunteer time. The National Academy estimates $1 million per nutrient and 18 months to go through this process. They're doing it, I believe, for riboflavin, for example, right now. So huge expense, huge amount of time. And so we have to keep in mind, is it worth it in the end? And I think Enora's presentation will maybe shed some light on that. Next slide. So why develop these harmonized values? In fact, it's very unlikely that requirements for absorbed nutrients differ much across populations. Their use for setting diets, dietary recommendations, and guidelines is what differs. And obviously that's different for each country depending on their food supply. There are all these missing values that we need and we don't have. IOM and EFSA values for infants and children tend to be extrapolated anyway from the infant adequate intake or the adult values. So there's some very implausible jumps in the NRVs. For example, calcium jumps, doubles within a one-day period for young children. And we're kidding ourselves when we think these have to be accurate to a decimal point. The true requirements are very variable among people. Estimates of bioavailability are very variable, and intakes are uncertain. Cost and time needed to do this is prohibitive. Programs and evaluations are ongoing, and these values are needed. Next slide. So what we did as a team, myself, Alicia Karakiri, and Suzanne Murphy, is we actually proposed harmonized values. Because we knew that the IOM and EFSA had done so much work on this, we took a look at what is missing when you combine these data sets and came up with good guesses, I think, for what the missing value should be. So the purpose then was to get as many AR and UL values as possible for global use out of these two reports, and also applying our own scientific judgment and the literature. Next slide. So what we're doing now, looking back at our graph here, is we're proposing on the left-hand side harmonized average requirements and harmonized upper levels. And so the EARs now would be called the HAR, harmonized, and the upper level would be called harmonized upper level. Next slide. So we used EFSA for most of this because these values were set most recently. The IOM are now 20 or so years old, except for calcium and vitamin D. Also, EFSA did some systematic reviews on some nutrients. This systematic use of systematic reviews is relatively recent, and the IOM didn't use it when setting their values in the past. Only vitamin D and calcium, which are the more recent reports. But there's still a lot of interest of missing information. EFSA only has ARs for 7 vitamins and 3 minerals. IOM has it for 10 vitamins and 9 minerals. So we use the IOM if there was no EFSA value, and there were a few nutrients that we did that for. If there were large differences between the two sets of value, which was very unusual, we chose one or the other and gave reasons for our selection. Next one. So this is an example of the criteria that were used in these different reports. There's 2 columns for IOM values for EARs and for the IOM, and 2 for EFSA. And then here's on the last column the decision that we made and the functional outcomes that were used in these reports. Next slide. Next slide. So here's an example of a table where we have the ARs for proteins, vitamins, and minerals, for example. And at the top of each column, it tells you where the source of that nutrient value came from. Next slide. We also estimate some of the ARs, and what we did is essentially back calculated from the AI values. This is not statistically supposed to be done, but even Alicia Karakiri, who's a world-class statistician, said this is much better doing this, just subtracting something from the AI than not having anything at all, even though it probably overestimates requirements. Much better though than using the AI or the RDA for estimating prevalence of inadequate intakes. Another issue is that the AIs are based on usual intakes of well-fed populations, so that would also cause an overestimate. We showed in the tables which ones were back calculated, and we didn't do it for young children, except for iron, zinc, and protein. Next slide. We had bioavailability corrections for iron and zinc. These are pretty standard at this point. WHO, FAO, the zinc consultative group have presented these, and these could be tweaked some more possibly. We say what is the usual phytate content of your diet, and you can choose which values to use. This is really the almost one and only modification that needs to happen globally, is for bioavailability. Next slide. We also developed harmonized upper levels using EFSA values and IOM values, mostly IOM, they're more recent, better explained, hardly any in FAO, WHO, and there's a lot of inconsistent criteria for how these are developed. But we did explain our decisions. Next slide. And the next slide shows the table that we came up with for the values, showing again comparisons of IOM and EFSA, and the decision that we used in the last column for the values and the criteria. Next slide. So to summarize, just about 2 slides, we now have a set of AR and UL values much larger than is currently available anywhere else. There are a lot of money spent developing these. We haven't made them up from thin air. They're, I would say, you know, $20 million was spent, no, 30 million, obtaining these values, euros and dollars. There's a very useful set of values now that we can use for evaluating intakes and programs and risk of excess intake, and compare across countries and regions. And then countries can take these values and set their own dietary guidelines, and they have to do that based on their own target median intake and adjusting for bioavailability of iron and zinc. And these values can be obviously just modified locally as well if people have objections for any reason. Last slide, I believe. So this is what Connie was questioning, and I think is really important as a next step. What local adjustments to NRVs are really needed? We are assuming, that's my small group, that all humans share similar biology and requirements for absorbed nutrients. And so there can be one set of biologically based NRVs for the world. And then countries and regions should consider adjustments that they need for their population. So bioavailability would be one, and there are algorithms available for doing that can be selected locally, iron and zinc mostly. Body size and activity. Well, for energy and protein, if you express the values per kilogram body weight, then you have dealt with the problem of people being different sizes. Genetics, maybe. There are some polymorphisms that may be so prevalent that the absorption of the nutrient is impaired and higher intakes would be useful. The MTHFR polymorphism is one that stands out as being affecting 25% of the population in Latin America, for example. Infection, well, really not everybody is infected. You shouldn't be just recommending higher intakes for the whole population because some people have infections. You should be dealing with the infections. And vitamin D always pops up, but that's a non-starter because, for example, in the IOM and EFSA, they recommend enough vitamin D for everyone because you just can't assume that people are getting enough for sunlight. So you just make that a non-issue. So the last thing is what next steps. I think it's really important to define and quantify those potential adjustments. And I'm studying a working group in ASN to do that. What factors really affect requirements, and can we quantify those? Is it as simple as I'm laying out here, or are there a lot more things we should consider? And then by how much should we adjust these NRVs in different situations, if at all? And the National Academy is going to be working on implementation of the toolkit and training on the application of NRVs, how to use them, because these are tricky. We've had interesting conversations in developing these talks for this meeting, and you know, how do you really do this? How do you estimate requirements for a population group and so on? I think a lot more training needs to happen along those lines. And that's my talk. Thank you very much, and I look forward to very much to hearing the other talks in this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. That's very, very useful, and it's really impressive from how we see the work that's started and now looking more and more promising to be applied. It's a pleasure for me to introduce the next speaker, Dr. Anna Lartey. She's currently a professor of nutrition at the University of Ghana. She was the director of nutrition and food systems division at FAO in Rome for 7 years, and she has led FAO work on food systems for nutrition. While at FAO, she also provided guidance on FAO scientific advice to Codex Committee on Nutrition for Special Dietary Use. So Anna received many honors, recognition, and awards. And it's really, really fortunate and a pleasure that we have her as a speaker to share with us the information that would deal with regulation and labeling regulations and harmonized nutrient reference values. So Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Emorn. I believe you can all hear me. Can you hear me, Emorn?
Yes.
Okay, great. I would like to use this opportunity to thank the organizers, ASN and ILSI, for inviting me to give this presentation. My topic is, as has been mentioned, looking at labeling regulations on harmonized nutrient reference values. I think Lindsay's presentation lays clearly the foundation for the presentation I am about to make. In terms of disclosures, I am a member of the Micronutrient Forum. I'm a board member of the Micronutrient Forum. I joined about a month ago. Now, in terms of this topic, my interest in this topic goes far back when I was a member of the Ghana delegation to the Codex Committee on Nutrition for Special Dietary Uses, where nutrient reference values are actively discussed. Also, when I served as Director of Nutrition at FAO, we worked very closely with WHO in looking at nutrient reference values. To go on next, why are nutrient reference values now coming in so strongly? I'd like to establish a little bit of a background. An analysis that has been done by various groups shows that dietary risk factors have become a major cause or contributor to the burden of disease. And this is seen in various parts of the world. Globally, we see that malnutrition in all its forms is the leading contributor to the burden of disease. In high burden countries, you see a similar pattern. In low income countries, you see a similar pattern, where our dietary risk factors are creating problems. And in fact, an analysis that was done shows that poor diet actually contributes about 20% of premature deaths. Now, the problem about poor diet is seen in the rising prevalence of overweight and obesity. You can see the negative impacts of the way we are eating here, that no region is actually being able to reduce the prevalence of overweight and obesity. And even in low-income countries, overweight and obesity prevalences are rising very fast. So in the last 3 to 4 years, many groups and organizations have come out requesting that we actually look at our food systems, transform our food systems to ensure that they deliver on healthy diets. The Global Panel for Agriculture and Food Systems, the high-level panel of experts of the Committee on World Food Security, the Future of Food, various groups have come out. But an important aspect of this food systems transformation is the consumer. There's the call to actually empower the consumer so that they can make healthy dietary choices. And this can be achieved through mandated nutrition labeling. Very, very important. After all, the consumer buys the food, and if they are empowered, they can buy the right food with that information, the right information that they are given. So this then brings us to a topic of food labeling and its importance for the consumer. It provides the consumer with information about the product to be able to make that informed decision. It also provides information on the nutrients on the package. Really, this is so crucial. They have to know what is in the package. It also builds consumer confidence in packaged foods. We all go to the shop, we look at the label, and we are able to decide whether to buy this product or not. It also protects the consumer health and prevents fraud from false and misleading nutrition claims. This happens in misleading nutrition claims happens in almost every country. Now, to show this example about how important food labeling is and how it can actually help the consumer make a decision, I would like to just present the example of the Chile experience. Chile has been experiencing rising prevalence of overweight and obesity, especially in children. The figures were really high. In 2016, they enacted a law on food labeling where and advertising to be able to curb this epidemic. So they came up with these labels, these black octagonal labels. So they use these labels because they are easy to understand. It's the front of pack labeling. And with this labeling, if you have this label on a product, that means that that product cannot be advertised to children under 14 years. Or could you include a toy in that product? Also, food containing that product cannot be sold in or near schools. So the intention is not that these products cannot be manufactured, but rather it will help change the food environment by informing the consumers about the composition of the product, the fat, the sodium, the calories, and the sugar. And the labels are so clear that when the consumer sees it, they would be able to understand it. It's so simple, very simple, easy to recognize, and to be understood that the consumer can easily make a decision for themselves. Now, for such labeling policies to work, it will require the collaboration of all stakeholders. It will require the governments coming out to enact these laws and regulations. It will require the food industry to comply and work with government so that they comply to these regulations. It will require the scientists to provide the evidence for making these policies. And also it will require the consumer corporation to make healthy and informed food choices. So all these stakeholders must come on board. Now let's talk about, Lindsay has given us a background about harmonized nutrient reference values, but we also need to talk about harmonizing food labeling regulations, because if you have harmonized regulations, it can avoid confusion for the consumer, you know, because they will have to deal with different market labels, which can be confusing. But if it's harmonized, it makes it easy. It gives better understanding for consumer and industry, because they will all be following the same rules. It also makes it easier for codecs to elaborate and update a single food labeling standard. And also it fosters a regional harmonization of labeling policies, because now with globalized trade, you know, it makes it very easy. Finally, it's also easier and less costly for food industry to comply with these labeling rules. This document you have here is a report, a book that was published by FAO in 2016, and it gives really background on some of these labeling policies, you know, that how countries can really have some of these harmonized labeling policies. But an important thing in some of these labeling, some of the labels are mandatory and some are voluntary. In my presentation here, I'll be talking mainly about the mandatory policies. And these mandatory rules require that all food products carry the same information, okay? And also the labeling legislation will apply to all foods, whether imported or nationally produced. They should have common information, okay? Now, in a mandatory food product, what's the kind of information you would need are the identity of the food, the name, the amount, the contact information, the information on the manufacturer, the country of origin, and the lot number. You also need information on the ingredient list, what really went into that product. And I've highlighted the quantitative nutrient declaration, because that is really relevant to our presentation here, and I'll come to that in a few minutes. And then also the food additives that have been added, and then also the date marking. Date marking is very important because it helps the consumer to determine and expect in terms of the safety and the quality of the food. Now let's talk about the nutrient declaration that we will see on a label. So the quantitative nutrient declaration. Codex recommends mandatory declaration of nutrient content on the label. And here, what should be declared are the energy, the protein, available carbohydrate, total fat, saturated fat, sodium, and total sugars, and also some vitamins and minerals. Now, the way this is declared is very important. Some will declare it as nutrient per serving, or per 100 grams, or per 100 ml, depending on the nature of the product. Now, with this, in terms of the mandatory nutritional information, some also look at reporting it as a percentage of the nutrient reference values. Now, Lindsay has already laid down the basis for the nutrient reference value, so I'll not go into that. But you know, when you express the value as a percentage of nutrient reference value, it provides an overview of the nutrient level in the food. It also enables the consumer to compare the percent nutrient reference values of different packaged foods, and so be able to decide which food to choose because of the percent contribution. Now, Codex proposed nutrient reference values for nutrition labeling purposes in the interest of harmonization. And these were put forth by FAO and WHO in 2004. Now, this table shows the Codex proposed reference values. Now, as I said, these in 2004. And at the moment, FAO and WHO are looking at revising some of these nutrient reference values. The process that they go through, it's here, and Lindsay took us through in details on these processes. You know, she gave it in her presentation, so I will not spend too much time on these slides. But the important thing that I want to highlight is that there is also public consultation. So where you see PC means public consultation. So at some point, the document or the questions that need to be addressed needs to be put out for public consultation to collect public views on it. So this is done also as part of the process. Now, CODES has also two types of nutrient reference values. They have nutrient reference values requirement, and this is based more on, it refers to nutrient reference values that are based on the levels of nutrients associated with nutrient requirement. And this is really what Lindsay has presented on. Then there is also the nutrient reference values based on non-communicable diseases. And these are based on the levels of nutrients associated with the reduction in the risk of non-communicable diseases. So CODES has established NRV NCDs for saturated fatty acids. Here, about 20 grams for saturated fatty acids, and for sodium, 2,000 milligrams. That means that you will be choosing NRV NCDs that have lower or up to these values, because lower or up to these values, they will be associated with reduced risk. So these are the two categories of NRVs that CODES has established. Now, talking about harmonized nutrient reference values for global use. With international trade, harmonized nutrient reference values provide a uniform basis to compare nutrient contributions of similar products. You know, so here I'm talking about the values themselves being harmonized, so that countries will use harmonized values. And there is value in this because you can compare the nutrient contribution of similar products. Now, when consumer goes on the market, the consumer is bombarded with so many products of the same product. You have so many versions, and this will really help the consumer a lot. Harmonized NRVs will also provide the same denominator, because you're talking about the same denominator for assessing nutrient claims. Harmonized nutrient reference values will also facilitate monitoring and enforcement of labeling policies. And countries will be able to meet the labeling policies of the international market. You know, we can set common labeling policies, and then we have harmonized nutrient reference values, so that it makes it very easy to actually set common policies for markets and for countries to be able to trade among themselves, because we are actually harmonizing the process. So again, basically, as has been said, I would say that food labeling policy, which includes a set of laws and guidelines for establishing this information, and these provide the basis for what needs to be done. Now, consumers may be confused when you have different forms of labeling on food products. Simple, standardized, non-misleading labeling is needed to facilitate consumer understanding. And then harmonized food labels are desirable based on what I've said earlier on, because it helps the consumer. And then finally, to come to the harmonized nutrient reference values are also needed, because they provide a common basis for comparing similar packaged products. They can facilitate trade between regions and countries when we use the same values than when every country has its own values, and that can create problems for the consumer. On this note, I'd like to say a big thank you for this opportunity. I hand over, Emorn, to you.
Yeah, I think I should turn the floor now to Connie for panel moderation.
Thank you, Emorn. I really enjoyed all the speakers. What a wonderful update. So we heard just now from the India experience. I think it would be really great to hear about the experience in Thailand. Emorn, could you start us off with this discussion?
Thank you very much. Actually, it's just a very brief intervention because when I listened to Anura, it just brought me back that there are so many things that we face that are quite similar. So briefly, the updated dietary reference intake for the Thais in Thailand came out last year. It was really quite a long gap from the earlier one. It's really nearly, I would say, 15 years off. But the main thing that we have found is that in 2019, when the Green Book came out, from what Lindsay has said from the National Academy of Science, the harmonization of approach to nutrient reference values, the committee has been able to study that and take a look at it and refine what they have worked on. The committee on the DRI for Thai has 8 working groups, and it has encompassed the reference body weight and height. That was right on, Anura. We need the reference body weight and height. And in Thailand, not only that that committee used the WHO reference, there was one of the data that they came up with for the adult, which is very clever, is that there was a study that talked about the standard size of Thai population. So they measuring, weight, height for all this, let's say, reference to. This is to be used for textile, for several of the standard size that could be used, and they are able to gather those information. We need those body weight, reference body weights across age group to be used. Also working groups on energy, macronutrients, vitamin, minerals, so forth. What the working group has found was that for these guidance from the National Academy of Science report is particularly the vitamin and mineral groups are able to capitalize on it. And the case study we found a very, very good, and it's a good learning process. What the committee, the working group did was to bring together IOM 2001, FAO WHO 2004, and the EFSA, which are the most recent. And we bring those together and take a look at most of the things we do, was based on EFSA as well. It was one of the experience that we have to do is that we try to follow the framework and also to try and use as much as we can whatever local data from Thailand, even some studies on stable isotope work, on some of the nutrient intake, on biomarkers, whatever available that are of credible quality, is to be put that together to come up with, let's say, a judgment or decision to be made. I want just to point out that the bioavailability is one of the biggest one, particularly for iron and zinc. It's so the time is not in sequence. When the publication of Harmonized NRV came out, that was that's how the work of working group has already been finished at mid-year. So it was not really, we are not able to capitalize on that. But I want to tell Lindsay that I random sampling, and I found that it is not too much of a difference, in particularly for some of these exemplar nutrient, because we are also based on the EFSA Thailand. So it seems to be the same school of thought. Besides bioavailability, one of the debates we have has to do with the bioconversion of vitamin A. And I want to leave that as one of the things that is still hang around the world as to what are we using. If we go on to that debate, it will be endless. There are many things there that I would have to say some of the key factors that really would make this context specific really need to be reviewed thoroughly just to be able to give guidance as to what we can use. The committee also value the recommendation of average requirement and the upper level of intake. And those also we found we don't have, one of the things that we know is a big data gap is the nutrient intake of the population, and that some of the nutrient we don't have the database, the complete database, the food composition table that could really be helpful. So some of these things, if you take a look at what the local or country has to go through, there's a lot of work, and it's also lots of gaps. And the guidance come from, can we borrow something, and what is the basis of that borrow? And so it keeps on going, and all this question, although I would say it's a good exercise for us, a lot of learning. My thought when I was doing this is that it's really perhaps all these efforts should exist at a sub-regional level rather than country by country. It should be a group of countries together sitting down and say, you know, we share similarities and we may be able to, you know, diet culture pattern, some of our population. Perhaps there will be something that we can bring this more rather than for country data. It's for have a region, sub-region or regional application. The other thing, last thing I want to say was that what is this set of nutrients that makes most sense for each country? Do we base this on Codex NRV, that's for trade, or do this set of nutrients that really should be considered as something that make the meaningful to us, to that country, to the sub-region, as to what we can use it not only for products but also for program policy, and say, okay, this is some of the things that may be unique to us. In certain countries, I would have to say, in certain countries, they might say this is the gap of nutrient. That's what they have to go forth, and you have to have a set of nutrients that would be helpful for you to guide the program and the decision of what needs to be recommended under the food-based dietary guidelines, for example, for healthy diet intake of that population. So context specific on those are also helpful. I'm just going to leave it as that, but want to say thank you. Thanks so much for that report and also for all this wonderful knowledge.
Thank you, Emorn. I appreciate your insights and your comments, especially about the sub-region rather than country by country, because I think the speakers have made a really provocative argument that it would save a lot of money, time, and confusion the more we harmonize across the globe. So if there are similar dietary intakes and bioavailability concerns and cultural practices by regions, then yeah, it would save even more time and effort and confusion if they got together. So let's open it up. Maybe all the speakers could unmute and show their screens if they're able, and we hope to see audience contributions and questions coming in. I would like to start maybe by asking Anura Kerphead, you made a persuasive argument about a common sense approach. Can we meet these recommendations with foods rather than adding chemicals? And it made me question some of the fortification that we've had. Most recently, folate in flour has really reduced neural tube defects, and people weren't choosing foods to get those levels of folate. And I wonder if there might be some exceptions to that. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. Thanks, Connie. You nailed me there. Yeah, folate is a tough one. And I think that's the one that you can't argue against the prevention of neural tube defects. So I think, yeah, you know, I think there are going to be exceptions to all these things. And
Okay.
we'll have to play it by ear. So I agree.
Okay, thank you for that. What do we know about the status of using and the barriers involved and the challenges with other countries besides India and Thailand and Ghana that we've heard from? Anyone?
Who's the question?
Yes.
Who's the
Okay.
question for?
For all of you. So one at a time.
Okay. This is Anna. I think I'll take it. In terms of barriers, I think that, and again, I'll look at the situation in sub-Saharan Africa. I think that, you know, the capacity to actually develop country or regional nutrient reference values, it's not really well developed. And again, the costs also associated with it and all. And so that's why, you know, a lot of the countries actually look up to FAO and WHO, so Codex, to come up with some of these values. Okay, so I think that's why the harmonized nutrient reference values are very important. If we have global values, it's very easy for countries to use, or the regions to use, some of these harmonized nutrient reference values, because otherwise it's too expensive. And we should not be encouraging each and every country, as has been well articulated by other speakers, to develop their own nutrient reference values. If we can, you know, have a harmonized NRVs, it will help everybody in the whole world. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. I think Emorn brought up maybe one of the most difficult pieces of the toolkit for many countries, and that's an adequate food composition database. And I think Emorn said you need a better one in Thailand even. But what countries would you say have adequate food composition tables versus that's a primary area needed improving?
Well, we always look up to USDA, and you know, when you have all the updated, and I think that the issue of food composition table and what goes in there, and it's just not so attractive for funding. And in the US, this is housed under USDA. I still remember the Department of Agriculture and USA, that is one of their main mission that they have to deliver, and they become part of their mission and their routine work, that to compile, to update, to make sure. And I was just also feel that maybe we are in the area of harmonized, maybe there could be effort, which I know GIFT is trying to do in FAO too, and others. How can we make all those efforts applicable, just like what we did, what Lindsay is doing with the average requirement? Because it takes a whole bunch of time, money, and all this, and you can never, it's just running after all this mandate and the demand that are never ending. So how can we share and be able to say, if you want to borrow this, there may be certain things you need to consider, but it is probably better than having nothing. That's my thought on it.
So you may be aware that recently, with a ILSI driven effort, the USDA had a great increase in their food composition tables with branded food items, because historically there were generic values for foods, but this effort caused industry to contribute hundreds of thousands of specific branded products. So the database just ballooned with ability to get more accurate data. So Lindsay, maybe I could ask you, why is it important to have good food composition tables? How is that information used in thinking of harmonized nutrient reference values?
Right. Well, I would add that I think that FAO food composition tables are also pretty terrific. And the toolkit attempts to identify these alternative sources of information on food intake, which are now being collected globally. There's a lot more information on that. Second point is that you don't need to measure intake of the population. I think Alicia Karakiri says sort of 100 people per target population group. So, you know, it's not quite as overwhelming as one would think. 2 days of data on each person. Through the intake data, obviously you to say what the likely bioavailability is. It's always an estimate, but that's one use of it. And fourth is to estimate the prevalence in which you do if you know the intake food composition. I think this is something that years ago showing that the composition of a particular food crop is incredibly variable, and it's just as good often to use sort of generic values for a species or a type of crop as it is to go and measure lots of it, and that it doesn't make that much difference in the end. I mean, I think people go overboard on needing food composition data. The challenge these days are those branded products and the fortified products and all that sort of thing, because they can have a large amount of one or more nutrients. So I think it's something that needs looking at again, but I think there's more data out there than people realize, that they don't need as much as they think they do, and so on. And composition varies by season, by soil, by everything else, and it's a bit of a difficult target. I don't know if that helped, but
yes, to kind of piggyback on what you said, when I used to do a lot of work with the role of phytic acid in influencing micronutrient bioavailability, I would look at what are the range of phytic acid levels, phytate levels in various staple crops. And in the US alone, they would gather hundreds of samples across the US, and there are books, reports that come out regularly of the phytate levels and phosphorus levels, and there'd be fivefold differences from the lowest to the highest. And so I'd try to manipulate by growing plants hydroponically with different levels of phosphorus to produce different levels of phytate to then see what the effect was on bioavailability. So the ranges very great. And you still wouldn't get at that if you had branded food composition tables or generic foods, because you don't know which one you're consuming at that various locale by that various season. But you probably make a good point that if we use the EARs instead of the RDAs to help us get at the target goals, we need less than we used to think. So it's less of a issue than we thought. Well, let's go to the next question. Maybe we could come back to something, Lindsay, you raised in your question. Is there really a need for local regional adjustments? And you said the main need for adjustment is bioavailability. But I want to know if any of the speakers have another reason that there might be an adjustment locally. I know Emorn said, consider what the programming is. So what's a value for that region? But is there anything besides bioavailability that you think might be an important factor to adapt the harmonized nutrient values for specific regions?
Can I come in?
Yes, Anura.
Yeah. So one is bioavailability, but the other, and I think this is important because we never really test this, is that we rely on the daily losses from the body pool as a fundamental measurement from which you then work out the amount you need. And I want to ask this question, and that comes from my protein background, because that really messes us up, is that we really had to measure the daily loss of protein on a zero protein diet to figure out the obligatory loss, which then we would replace. And I know for the micronutrient world, you never do that. And I often wonder whether if we measured these losses more carefully, and we did it in subjects who were on a low intake, whether we would get different values in different regions just because they had habitually low intakes.
If you had to get them in steady state for a micronutrient, that could take long enough that no IRB would ever let you test that for the risks of the people. But I see your point. Nutrition often poses lots of challenges in designing studies compared to other kinds of studies like drug studies, because you really can't ever get to zero of an essential nutrient in the background, or not permitted to try. You can get low, but to zero, you raise a really good challenge, I think.
But even for, go ahead, Lindsay.
Well, my rebuttal of that, as somebody who's done lots of balanced studies, is they're meaningless in the way that people usually eat. And I've done protein balance studies, and you have this much for breakfast, this for lunch, this for dinner, and then tomorrow you have twice that much, the next day you have half that much. And so you can't just say, well, this is the habitual intake, because the body is responding to higher and lower intakes all the time. And then for many of these micronutrients, efficiency of absorption is really poor at higher intakes and really high at lower intakes. And I don't think much work has been done on, how long it takes the body to adjust the percent absorption based on, does it change from meal to meal? For some micronutrients, it does. I mean, it's a whole can of worms once one starts talking about constant intakes and they're affecting requirements. And
Anura, yes.
Yeah, I've got to rebut Lindsay because she reminds me of Vernon Young, with whom I'd have a lot of arguments about this. And we spent all kinds of time and experiments trying to figure out exactly what you were talking about, Lindsay. How long does it take? What level is it that you need to think about when you actually measure amino acid requirements? And we've gone up to 3 weeks just doing continuous measurements of balances to see whether it was stable or not. And I think that's why the amino acid world benefited from Vernon's wisdom in this sort of thing. And I learned a lot from him, and I use those same principles now. So I'm going to hold you to that, Lindsay.
No, but the effect of protein is not, it's not a gut level issue so much as a whole body reaction to intakes. But for micronutrients, much of the effect is right there in that meal. What do you consume? And that will affect the absorption. So I think it's, as always, it's different for different nutrients.
So I wondered something that has never been tested, thinking of calcium, that maybe instead of trying to figure out what the habitual intake is, with the real biological relevance is how often during the day or the integrated amount of time that calcium levels in your system fall low enough to trigger the release of parathyroid hormone, because that's what causes bone to go into a resorption mode. And so maybe we're approaching the entire thing wrong. Instead of intake or habitual or whatever, it's how many minutes a day have you turned on parathyroid hormone? Maybe that's a better way. So here's a hypothesis for junior researchers to try to take up.
I want to come in here because there are questions from the audience. So Connie, do you see that, or should I read it?
Yeah, please read it, because I'm not seeing that.
Okay, it's already yes, I saw it on the screen. It's a so the questions from Joanna Dwyer. Hi, thank you for an excellent and thoughtful set of talks. Is there a place for ASN, ILSI, and other professional organizations and the foundations to help in fostering the regional working groups Emorn spoke about, as well as relying solely on FAO/WHO so that things move a little faster? So that's I think the questions to Lindsay and you, Connie. And the next question, I would think that this might be for Anna. Didn't say, but on food labeling, what's the view of the panelists to the display of percent NRV per serve versus per 100 gram? I'm going to give this to Anna. Yes, okay. Connie, yes, sorry about that. But,
no, I appreciate you doing that. Give that to Anna and then come back to Johanna's question.
Okay. Anna, could you please answer that one?
Yes, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Thank you for the question. I think it's a very important question. Yes, we have been talking about helping the consumer understand the way food is labeled. Okay. Now, if we have different versions, sometimes it can confuse. But let's look at the advantage. You know, here you are. You have a nutrient per 100 grams. Nutrient per 100 grams. Now, the denominator here is the food itself. Now, depending on the way the food is formulated, depending on the moisture content, there are so many things that can really shift the value if you are working on just per 100 gram. But if you are working on a nutrient reference value, you can also have the same shifts. But if we are all using a harmonized nutrient reference value, it makes it easier, because you are comparing the content of the nutrient in that food in relation to the requirement. And we assume that we all will have the same requirement. And so that's where the harmonized nutrient reference value will come in and will be useful. And for that, for the consumer, when we all are using a common denominator, it's easier to compare different foods for the consumer to make the right decision. But per 100 gram, the composition of the food can even affect the nutrient content. So it can vary. The same food, depending on how it's formulated and whatnot, you can see that you'll be getting different values, the nutrient per 100 gram. It doesn't give you the standard harmonized value that will enable the consumer make the decision. But I know per 100 gram is the easiest. It's the easiest for most producers to report on that. Nutrient reference value, we are saying that it's more useful if we are using the same nutrient reference value to look at the nutrient content per the value we are talking about. I hope that's clear.
Anna,
yes.
Thank you for that. It's a little bit different. The question, maybe it's, I'm sorry, maybe I read it too fast. The question addresses whether the display of the percent NRV, the nutrient reference value, should be done per serving of food, the serving size, or should it be percent nutrient reference value per 100 gram? I think that's the questions. I was looking at closely again. So should we display percent NRV per serving, or should they display percent NRV per 100 gram?
That's interesting. That's it's a new listen. So per 100 gram, how much of the nutrient reference value is presented in that 100 gram? Or per serving, how much of that nutrient reference value is presented? Okay, this is another formulation of presentation, and that's where I'm saying that it will be really very important if we come to an agreed way, and this is where codex guidance is needed. You know, nutrient reference value per serving, per 100 gram, or percent NRV. These are all different formulations. But if we can come to an agreed way that this is how we want to present it, the consumer understands it and consumers are educated, then we go with one way of presenting the information. But you can look at nutrient reference per 7, it can be done. I mean, all these formulations can be done. But of what value will it be for the consumer if they have to juggle with all of these? I think I will recommend that if we want to use nutrient reference value, let's go with the nutrient content in terms of the percent contribution to the nutrient reference value. That is what I would recommend.
So back to
Johanna.
Back to Johanna's question. Can we have organizations help with working groups to make the process go a little bit faster? Well, Lindsay talked about the working group in ASN that she's charged. And so I think that's one way. And yeah, I've been starting last year at the Costa Rica meeting, I've been hinting to ILSI that would be a really great thing for the branches to undertake, is to set up regional groups to help consider these things together. So I hope ILSI and ASN and any other organizations will play a role and help out FAO and WHO.
National Academy too, and training application, IUNS probably. I'm nervous about this regional idea. I think that many of the resources that regions would need are resources the whole world needs. Systematic reviews, food composition, and so on. Some countries have similar diets, but similar are they? How different is Thailand from some countries in Thailand? some countries in Africa, you know, there's such a variation in diet. But I don't see the need for regional except for the implementation and the training and the discussions. I don't hear how useful local is. I think we run the risk of having all sorts of different things pop up that are based on one country's local data. It might not apply to others. I don't know yet. That's the sort of thing we really need to understand better. But I would rather an effort be put into information that's available for everybody rather than taking it up region by region at this point. It's really, but I could be wrong.
Thank you for those thoughts. Both Emorn and Nura talked about finding a reference body weight value. And I wondered if instead, because even within a population, there's going to be a huge range of height and weight and so forth. Should we be moving towards putting recommendations for nutrient intake on a per kilogram body weight to not force that reference body weight? Anura and Emorn.
Yeah.
Anura, yes.
Can I have a go at that?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. I think this makes a lot of sense, but I think, you know, you have to be careful because in the factorial method, when you do it per kilogram, actually, I can't think of anything bad with this because one of the problems we had when working with the whole body was that we had to take the variability of body weight into the factorial method and propagate that to get the distribution of the requirements. And in fact, when we remove body weight variability, we actually find that per kg, we got a lower variability. And this is something that actually I think there's a lot of objection to this. Many are uncomfortable with it because eventually you get a lower daily requirement as well, because you then might say, I'll measure the weight of the target population, multiply the requirement into that weight, which is the present weight, rather than an ideal weight. So there is resistance to that, although I like it, to be honest. I'll leave it to Emorn to give her view.
No, yeah, I agree, and I really think that you know, it's an interesting thing to say that do we you know, with the reference body weight that come with height, and also it could be proportion, body composition, how do we put that together? Like when you say something about the BMI, that's just one of the things that I thought about, is whether that is also could be one of the variable where we need to take a look at in our population, and how this is one of the things. If you take a look at the population in Southeast Asia and versus the other part of you know, the East Asia and South Asia, there are certain different that I think could be looked at, and perhaps we could, there's certain thing we can compare notes. And another things that I think we could be doing in Harmony is that rather than had every one country say, well, how do we do with this reference thing, is to be able to bring some data together and take a look at it as we have.
So we kind of have this juxtaposed goals in that for food labeling and other uses like that, you'd like to have harmonized values, a single value, to simply label the product and to communicate to consumers. But in this era of personalized nutrition, we would like to be able to personalize it for our own needs. And so maybe some way to adapt for height, weight, body composition, and so forth would be attractive for a lot of people who want to know, what about for me? And so we could try on both levels for the different purposes, perhaps. Well, I think our time is up, and I want to give a lot of thanks. I want to thank the speakers. Outstanding job. And my co-host for this session, Emorn. It's so good to see you again. I want to thank American Society for Nutrition and ILSI for working together to make this session possible. And most of all, I want to thank the audience. There was a really good turnout for this session, and I hope you will take it upon yourselves to help push this very useful idea of harmonizing what NRS does, harmonizing approaches, harmonizing how we express it, how we harmonize applying it to the label, like Anna said. And thanks to Lindsay for making this an important topic for ASN to take it forward. And thanks to National Academies for their work with the toolkit and advancing the training. So that will end our session, and thanks to Stefan and all the staff for pulling off the technical logistics.
Thank you, and thank you, Connie, for those kind words. There was a few remained points in the chat that is quite interesting. One from FAO, Maria Sipsity, that EFSA is establishing an initiative, International Liaison Group on Nutrient Reference Value Methodology by EFSA to facilitate collaboration and exchange of the methodological approach at the global and regional level, and that should be a collaboration. And also the Caribbean would like to see that some collaboration partner can be made for there. And Johanna has her last one on how can various side groups within the various countries be induced to agree to this proposal. You cannot ignore the politics of buy-in in this discussion, and that's one possible reason for stimulating regional discussion to stimulate interest and buy-in not only of scientists but officials in the country. So thank you for all the audience for chiming in all those questions and helpful comments. And thank you to speakers, and also Connie, thank you for the great share.